Hello, I'm Wendy. Today I'm painting trees and foliage, a loose watercolour demonstration with some sponge work. I worked from a photograph of mine, well actually one or two photographs, and I put this little group of trees together. It's a group of trees on the edge of a field and it's backlit by the sun. I'm working on Saunders waterford paper. It's £140 weight, not surface, and it was on a block. These are the blocks that are sort of stuck together, and then when you've painted, you remove the sheet on the top that you painted on. It means you don't have to stretch the paper, and it prevents cockling. I'll show you the finished painting here, and then during the demonstration, I hope you'll get some idea of how I achieved some of these loose watercolour effects. I did use the sponge quite a lot, which is fairly new to me. I've not really liked it before, but I'm starting to get to grips with it and I'm really liking it. This video will not be a step-by-step tutorial like some of my others. It's more of a demonstration of loose watercolour techniques. It was quite an experimental painting. I had no set idea of how it was going to look in the end. I did know that I wanted to get a central area in the middle with the sun showing through and some warmth. And I wanted to get a lot of texture into the foliage and a little bit of warmth in there. I think the spring greens, early summer greens can look really cold, so I did want to try and get a little bit of warmth, as I said. And also I did put a little bit of blue in the foreground to suggest bluebells, but you could put any colour in there. You could put white for the anemones, you could put a little bit of pink for the campion, just whatever suits and whatever goes with your picture would look nice. If I remember, I think this painting took about 2 hours to paint, including the drying times, and going to make a cup of tea, things like that. So you will find that I've edited quite a lot. I've got the running time down to less than 15 minutes, so I have done some editing that involves speeding up parts of the video, and also I've cut out some of the repetitiveness. I started off the painting by putting in the paler background colours. My palette in this picture comprised of a tube green, which was sap green, which always works well and is a good mixer, and then I mixed other greens from cadmium yellow pale and from cobalt blue or ultramarine. Later on in the picture I mixed some darker greens, and for those darker greens I used Prussian blue, and I also added some burnt sienna to the mix as well. It's the palette, if you're following my channel, that I generally use. There was nothing particularly anything different that I used in this picture. While the background was drying, I put some marks in the foreground using a sponge. I put some blue marks for the bluebells, although you'll find later on most of those got covered up, and I put on some lighter greens and some yellowy greens for the lighter little bits of the foreground. Again, most of those will be covered up, but it does give more interest to the final picture. Even if the foreground is going to be very dark, if you've got some of these lights just sort of peeking through underneath. In this case, I wanted the background to be dry before I did the sponge work, but you may find that you'd like a softer effect sometimes, so you can work wet into wet at the beginning, and then as the paint and the paper gradually dry, then the marks will become more definite. The sponge marks will become more definite as you progress through the painting. I'm starting with my lighter greens, and then as you'll see I'll be adding my darker greens to this area a little bit later on. As I said at the beginning of the video, I've never really liked sponges that much, but for my recent sort of experiments using them and doing some bit of painting with them, I found I've experimented with different sorts of sponges, and I must admit I prefer the natural sponge to the more synthetic ones, but it's up to you to experiment with the different ones and see which one you like. There's a tendency when you're using sponge to get the same sort of marks all the time, and it becomes very boring and very sort of repetitive looking marks. So what I found is as you're working away with it, move the sponge around and put it down, you know, in different directions, and change the direction of the marks you're making, and also increase and decrease the pressure as you're working as well. So some are sort of more splodgy and wet into wet, and others a bit more defined. And try and get a real variety of marks as you're working. Spraying a little bit of water here and there can be quite effective as well. It seems to enhance the textural effects of the sponge work. I always like to work around a picture. I don't like to complete an area totally before I move on to the next part of the picture. Now in this case here I'm letting the, the top area of the picture dry and putting some of the darker marks on in the foreground. Looking at it now, and I felt at the time those marks were getting a little bit samey and a little bit repetitive, and I was aware of that. So I think during the painting process I was trying to blur some of those marks together so that they weren't, you know, just those separate samey looking marks. Try and also get some a little bit darker, and I think you'll see as I'm painting through here that I'm getting some darker marks by not pressing the sponge quite as hard on the paper in some areas as others. At this stage I just added a little bit more of the blue with a very small brush to stand for some of the bluebells that were in there. As I said at the beginning of the video, you could have some white anemones in there, some of the pink campion, or any colour that you wanted in there. You could have some yellow just to break up the green. It depends what season you're painting, of course. It was bluebell time at this time, but this particular video I think you could use for painting trees and foliage, whatever the season is. I've speeded the next little bit of the video up here, again because it is quite repetitive, but you can see that I'm just putting more sponge work into the top area of the picture, trying to vary the strokes, trying to vary the tones of the colours, and leaving the gaps where the sky is and in that middle area where the light's shining through. The foreground area in my reference photos was quite dark, so I did darken it up with a darker mix of green here. I like the effect of spraying on watercolour sometimes. It adds some interest in the picture, and so I did a little bit of spraying here in the foreground. A few final darks here on the picture, particularly on the right hand side. I was very aware of keeping some tonal differences in this area, otherwise it can look quite bland. I'm finding also recently that if you use a little brush with some dark green on there and add that to the sponge work, you can increase interest, you can increase tonal contrast in your picture, and I think it's quite effective. And finally, we're putting in the tree trunks. I used a mixture of browns using ultramarine and burnt sienna, and just vary the tones a little bit. These tree trunks were quite dark because they got the sun behind them. Using a small brush, working a little bit wet into wet for the trunks, trying all the time to sort of intertwine them in and out of the foliage areas. Almost finished, but I felt the left-hand side of the picture got a little bit dull and wasn't very interesting. So a little bit of very dark green on a sponge, I think improved that little corner quite a lot. And a few little specks of opaque white. They don't come amiss, do they, in a woodland picture? So there we are. I really enjoyed experimenting with the sponge work, and I liked putting the little marks in there with the brush along with the sponge work itself. I thought that was quite effective. As always, I hope you found something useful in my video and that you'll have a bash at painting something like this yourself. If you do, you can always post your work in my Facebook group. There's links in the description below. And don't forget, if you've not done so already, to subscribe to my channel if you don't want to miss anything that's coming up in the future. Bye for now.